They called it the Samurai of the Skies. The Japanese Zero fighter was fast, agile, and deadly. In the early years of World War II, Allied pilots dreaded the sight of its rising sun-painted wings. Against the Zero, most American fighters didn't stand a chance. Pilots whispered that it could outfly anything, outclimb anything, and turn tighter than the laws of physics should allow. And then, something strange happened. In 1943, a new American fighter appeared over the Pacific. Big, bulky, and heavy, it looked nothing like the sleek Japanese Zero. Japanese pilots laughed when they first saw it. Surely this overweight beast could never keep up. Surely it was just another easy kill. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. Because this so-called clumsy fighter would go on to annihilate the Zero in battle, becoming one of the deadliest aircraft of the entire war. It was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, and it didn't just fight the Zero, it swept it from the skies.
The Zero's reign. To understand why the Hellcat's arrival was such a turning point, we need to go back to the very beginning of the Pacific War, when the Japanese Zero seemed untouchable. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, first flown in 1939, was revolutionary. It could reach speeds of over 330 miles per hour, climb faster than almost anything the Allies had, and outturn every opponent. In December 1941, as Japanese forces launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, Zeros roared overhead, cutting through American aircraft with ease. In the Philippines, over the jungles of Malaya, across the waters of the Dutch East Indies, the Zero ruled the skies. Allied pilots, flying outdated aircraft like the Brewster Buffalo, the P-40 Warhawk, or the early Wildcats, found themselves hopelessly outclassed. Many went into combat knowing they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and often outnumbered. The Zero's dominance wasn't just about speed and agility, it was about philosophy. Japanese engineers stripped everything non-essential from the aircraft. No heavy armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, nothing that would weigh it down. The result? A plane light enough to dance in the sky, but fragile enough to burn with a single burst of machine gun fire. Still, in those early months, fragility didn't matter. The Zero was killing faster than anyone could shoot back, and with each victory, its legend grew. The Wildcat fights back. But while the Zero was terrorizing Allied pilots, something important was happening. U.S. Navy pilots were learning. The first major lesson came from the F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's workhorse at the start of the war. The Wildcat wasn't nearly as agile as the Zero, but it had one thing going for it. It was tough. A Wildcat could take bullets, absorb punishment, and keep flying. And then came the tactic that leveled the playing field, the Thatch Weave. Invented by Commander John Thatch, it was a simple but brilliant maneuver. Two Wildcats would fly side by side. When a Zero attacked one, the two planes would weave across each other's paths, forcing the Zero into the gun sights of its wingman. The Thatch Weave didn't make the Wildcat better than the Zero, but it gave pilots a fighting chance. Suddenly, American flyers weren't just running or dying. They were holding their own. But everyone knew it wasn't enough. America needed a fighter not just to survive the Zero, but to defeat it.
The birth of the Hellcat. That's when the engineers at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation stepped in. Nicknamed the Iron Works because of their rugged designs, Grumman had already built the Wildcat. But they knew something better was needed, something stronger, something faster. The result was the F6F Hellcat. From the start, the Hellcat was designed with one mission: beat the Zero. It was bigger and heavier than the Wildcat, powered by the massive Pratt and Whitney R 2800 double wasp engine, pumping out over 2,000 horsepower. That gave it speed, up to 380 miles per hour, and incredible climbing power. It carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, packing a punch that could shred a Zero with a single burst. It had thick armor, bulletproof glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Where the Zero was fragile, the Hellcat was a tank with wings. The first Hellcat prototype flew in June 1942, just 1 month after the Battle of Midway, a battle that had already shown the world that Japan could be beaten. And when the Hellcat entered combat in 1943, Japanese pilots didn't take it seriously. To their eyes, it looked too heavy, too sluggish, too American. They laughed, but the laughter wouldn't last long. The Hellcat enters the war. First encounters. When the F6F Hellcat first entered service in late 1943, it went straight into action in the Pacific. Carrier decks across the ocean began filling with these bulky, powerful fighters. For the Japanese, it was just another American plane. Nothing to fear. Their first impressions seemed confirmed. Against the sleek lines of the Zero, the Hellcat looked clumsy. Its broad wings, tall fuselage, and heavy frame gave it a brutish appearance. Japanese pilots were convinced it would never stand a chance in the elegant dance of aerial combat. But appearances were deceiving. The Hellcat had been designed for a different kind of fight. When the first Hellcats clashed with Zeros over places like Rabaul and the Solomon Islands, something became clear. This wasn't just another Wildcat. The Hellcat could climb with the Zero. It could dive faster, it could hit harder, and, most importantly, it could survive. For the first time, American pilots had a plane that gave them confidence. They could go into battle knowing they had the advantage, and the kill tallies began to prove it. The tactical edge. But raw power wasn't enough. The Hellcat's dominance came from a combination of machine and man. By 1943, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pilots had learned valuable lessons from bitter defeats. Rule number 1, never dogfight a Zero. The Zero was unbeatable in a turning fight. Try to outmaneuver it, and you'd end up shot down. Rule number 2, fight vertically. The Hellcat's engine gave it superior climbing ability. Pilots used boom and zoom tactics, diving onto a Zero, firing, and then climbing back into the sky. The Zero couldn't follow without stalling. Rule number 3, use teamwork. The thatch weave still applied. But with Hellcats, it became devastating. 2 Hellcats weaving together could cut through entire formations of Zeros, their 6 heavy machine guns creating a wall of lead. And rule number 4, take the hit if you must. The Hellcat was tough. In fact, pilots called it the ace maker, because it gave even average pilots the durability to survive mistakes. If a Zero put holes in your wings, chances were you could still limp home. The same couldn't be said for the Zero. One burst into its fuel tank and it was gone in flames. The result? Kill ratios began to tilt dramatically in America's favor. In some squadrons, Hellcat pilots achieved 7-1 victories over Zeros. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by mid-1944, the Pacific War was entering a new phase. The U.S. Navy was advancing across the ocean, capturing islands to use as airfields and naval bases. The next big step, the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Japanese knew these islands were crucial. If America took them, they would be within bombing range of Japan itself. Desperate, the Japanese Navy threw everything they had into one last massive carrier battle. On June 19, 1944, hundreds of Japanese planes roared into the sky, determined to stop the American fleet. Waiting for them were waves of Hellcats, stacked high over the carriers, radar guiding them toward their targets. What followed became legendary. The Hellcats tore into Japanese formations with brutal efficiency. Zeros and other Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in flames, one after another. The Japanese pilots, many of them poorly trained replacements by this stage of the war, never stood a chance. By the end of the day, U.S. pilots had destroyed more than 300 Japanese aircraft, while losing barely 30 of their own. The battle was so lopsided that American pilots began calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was a slaughter. The Japanese carrier force never recovered, and at the center of it all was the Hellcat. The shock to Japan. For the Japanese, the shock was immense. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air power, was no longer feared. The mighty Imperial Navy, once proud and invincible, had been humbled in the skies by the Hellcat. Veteran Japanese pilots, those who had survived since Pearl Harbor, were few and exhausted. The replacements coming up had only a fraction of the training. They were being sent into combat against Hellcats with barely 100 hours of flight time. Against well-trained American pilots in rugged, powerful aircraft, they had no chance. Japanese commanders could no longer laugh at the Hellcat. They now recognized it as the single greatest threat to their survival in the skies. But it was too late. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no going back. The Ace Maker. The Hellcat soon earned a reputation among American pilots as the Ace Maker. Why? Because it turned ordinary pilots into legends. A pilot needed 5 confirmed kills to become an ace. Thanks to the Hellcat's durability and firepower, dozens of U.S. pilots racked up kill counts at astonishing speed. Men like David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's top ace of the war, scored 34 aerial victories, all in Hellcats. On a single day, October 24, 1944, he shot down 9 Japanese planes in just one mission. Stories like his spread across the fleet. The Hellcat wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of American dominance in the Pacific skies. Total air superiority. By late 1944, the Hellcat wasn't just another fighter. It was the backbone of American naval aviation. Everywhere the U.S. Navy went, Hellcats ruled the skies. The Japanese Zero, once feared, was now hopelessly outdated. The Hellcat was faster, tougher, and deadlier. And while the Japanese were still producing Zeros, their factories could not keep pace with America's industrial might. The U.S. was churning out Hellcats by the thousands. The numbers tell the story. Over 12,000 Hellcats were built during the war. Nearly 70% of all aerial victories in the Pacific were scored by Hellcat pilots. The kill ratio? An astonishing 19-1 in the Hellcat's favor. The message was clear. The era of the Zero was over, the kamikaze threat. But even as the Hellcat reigned supreme, a new and terrifying threat emerged, the kamikazes. By late 1944, Japan's situation was desperate. Their navy was crippled, their air force shattered, and their pilots inexperienced. Out of desperation, Japan began sending pilots on suicide missions, deliberately crashing their planes into American ships. For Hellcat pilots, this was a grim new challenge. It wasn't about outmaneuvering or outgunning an opponent. It was about stopping them before they could hit the fleet. Day after day, Hellcats launched from carriers, intercepting kamikaze formations miles away from the ships. The skies over the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa turned into deadly hunting grounds. Hellcats shot down thousands of kamikazes, but some always got through, slamming into carriers, destroyers, and transports. Still, without the Hellcat's relentless defense, the toll would have been far higher. Many American sailors owed their lives to the pilots flying those blue-painted Hellcats, standing guard against Japan's final act of desperation. Iwo Jima and Okinawa. As the U.S. pushed closer to Japan itself, the Hellcat played a crucial role in two of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At Iwo Jima in early 1945, Hellcats escorted B-29 bombers and strafed Japanese positions, softening defenses for the Marines hitting the beaches. They fought off what little Japanese air resistance remained, ensuring the skies were American-controlled. Then came Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. For nearly 3 months, Hellcats flew constant patrols, intercepting wave after wave of Japanese aircraft. Many of these were kamikazes, determined to sink the American fleet. Hellcat pilots fought from dawn to dusk, sometimes flying 4 or 5 missions a day. They shot down hundreds of enemy planes, but the relentless kamikaze attacks made Okinawa one of the most dangerous campaigns of the war. Even so, the Hellcat once again proved its worth. It was the shield that kept the American invasion alive. In the collapse of Japanese air power. By mid-1945, Japan's once feared air force was finished. The Zero, the symbol of its early victories, was obsolete. Japan's factories were bombed, its fuel supplies dwindling, its pilots undertrained and under-equipped. Meanwhile, Hellcat squadrons continued to grow stronger. On carrier decks stretching across the Pacific, rows of Hellcats sat ready, their engines rumbling like thunder. Japanese pilots no longer laughed when they saw them.
The pilot's perspective. Ask the men who flew it, and they'll tell you the Hellcat was a pilot's dream. Many American aviators stepped into the cockpit of the Hellcat as young men with little experience. Thanks to the plane's forgiving nature, they survived long enough to gain skill, and many became aces. Pilots described the Hellcat as steady, reliable, and powerful. It could roll into a dive, fire its 6 heavy machine guns, and then climb out of danger before the enemy knew what happened. It gave them confidence. Confidence to go on the offensive. Confidence to protect the fleet. Confidence to survive the war and make it home. For the Japanese, it was the opposite story. By 1944, few of their veterans remained. The replacements were rushed into combat, often with just a fraction of the training American pilots received. Facing the Hellcat, they had little chance. Many died without scoring a single kill. The Industrial War. The story of the Hellcat is also the story of American industry. Grumman factories on Long Island worked around the clock, producing thousands of Hellcats at incredible speed. While Japan struggled to replace its losses, America was flooding the Pacific with new planes. Every carrier launched more Hellcats. Every battle added more to their numbers. It was a tide that Japan could not hold back. By the end of the war, over 12,000 Hellcats had been built in just 2 years. It was an industrial miracle, and proof that wars are won not only by bravery in the skies, but also by the workers on the ground. The end of the war and legacy. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the numbers spoke louder than words. Hellcats had destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, the highest kill count of any Allied fighter in the Pacific. They had carried pilots to ace status in record numbers. They had shielded the fleet from kamikazes. They had escorted bombers, supported ground troops, and swept the skies clean of opposition. What began as a plane the Japanese mocked as clumsy had ended as the ultimate predator of the Pacific. The F6F Hellcat proved a simple truth. Wars are not won by appearance or by underestimating your enemy. They are won by preparation, resilience, and the right tools at the right time. For the United States Navy, the Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was the sword and the shield that carried them from the dark days of 1942 to victory in 1945. And for the Japanese Zero, Once the terror of the skies, its fate was sealed the moment it underestimated the big, rugged, blue-painted beast known as the Hellcat. Comparing legends. When historians look back at World War II in the Pacific, they often compare two planes, the Mitsubishi Zero and the Grumman Hellcat. The Zero was revolutionary when it appeared. It was fast, nimble, and elegant. It symbolized Japan's early dominance. But it was built for offense, not survival. Its light frame gave it agility, but it couldn't absorb damage. It was designed for a short war, a war Japan hoped to win quickly. The Hellcat, by contrast, was built for endurance. It was rugged, heavily armed, and designed for long campaigns. It wasn't as graceful, but it was forgiving. It could protect its pilot. It could take hits and keep flying. In short, it was built for the long war that the Pacific became. In that way, the Hellcat represented America's war strategy. A war not of quick strikes, but of grinding advance, overwhelming production, and sheer staying power.
The pilot's perspective. Ask the men who flew it, and they'll tell you the Hellcat was a pilot's dream. Many American aviators stepped into the cockpit of the Hellcat as young men with little experience. Thanks to the plane's forgiving nature, they survived long enough to gain skill, and many became aces. Pilots described the Hellcat as steady, reliable, and powerful. It could roll into a dive, fire its 6 heavy machine guns, and then climb out of danger before the enemy knew what happened. It gave them confidence. Confidence to go on the offensive. Confidence to protect the fleet. Confidence to survive the war and make it home. For the Japanese, it was the opposite story. By 1944, few of their veterans remained. The replacements were rushed into combat, often with just a fraction of the training American pilots received. Facing the Hellcat, they had little chance. Many died without scoring a single kill. The Industrial War. The story of the Hellcat is also the story of American industry. Grumman factories on Long Island worked around the clock, producing thousands of Hellcats at incredible speed. While Japan struggled to replace its losses, America was flooding the Pacific with new planes. Every carrier launched more Hellcats. Every battle added more to their numbers. It was a tide that Japan could not hold back. By the end of the war, over 12,000 Hellcats had been built in just 2 years. It was an industrial miracle, and proof that wars are won not only by bravery in the skies, but also by the workers on the ground. Symbol of victory. The Hellcat became more than a machine. It became a symbol. To sailors on the deck of a carrier, the sight of Hellcats circling overhead meant safety. To Marines on the beaches, the roar of Hellcats strafing enemy positions meant hope. To bomber crews, the shadow of a Hellcat escort meant survival. And to Japanese pilots, the silhouette of a Hellcat meant one thing: fear. The Hellcat had flipped the balance of the Pacific War. Where once the Zero ruled the skies, now the Hellcat hunted them down relentlessly. Final reflections. By the war's end, the Hellcat's record spoke for itself. 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air kills in the Pacific were scored by Hellcats. Over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. A kill-to-loss ratio of nearly 19-1. No other fighter in the Pacific could match those numbers. The Zero, once the terror of the skies, had been eclipsed. Its reign was short, but its legend remained. The Hellcat, however, proved that legends could be toppled. The war in the Pacific was not won overnight. It was a brutal, grinding struggle fought across endless miles of ocean. But with the Hellcat, the U.S. Navy gained not just an aircraft, but a weapon. Inside the cockpit,
a pilot's view. Imagine climbing into the cockpit of an F6F Hellcat. The smell of fuel and oil hangs in the air. The canopy closes with a metallic clank. Ahead of you sits a wide nose and a long strip of ocean reflecting sunlight. The double wasp engine roars to life, shaking the aircraft like a beast impatient to be unleashed. You taxi down the carrier deck, the sea spray misting your canopy, and then the catapult launches you into the blue void. At first, the Hellcat feels heavy, not as nimble as the Zero. But the moment you dive, the plane becomes a predator. The controls are steady, the guns are ready, and you know, if you get hit, this machine will keep you alive. Veterans described the Hellcat as a gentle giant, a plane that forgave mistakes, that brought rookie pilots home when other fighters would have abandoned them to the sea. The Japanese perspective. While American pilots were gaining confidence, Japanese aviators were facing a grim reality. The Zero, once unstoppable, had become outdated. Its lightweight design, once its greatest advantage, now turned into a fatal weakness. It couldn't take hits, and it couldn't match the Hellcat's speed in a dive. Worse still, Japan's pilot training system had collapsed. Early in the war, pilots trained for years, mastering every skill before combat. By 1944, training was shortened to mere months. Many new pilots had barely fired their guns in practice before facing the Hellcat in battle. Veterans like Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces, wrote with sorrow about watching young men thrown into hopeless fights. He said, "They were brave, but bravery cannot win against machines built for war, and men trained to use them."
Carrier warfare and strategy. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was part of a grander strategy. The U.S. Navy had perfected carrier warfare. Massive task forces of carriers, battleships, and destroyers moved across the Pacific like floating fortresses. Hellcats provided the shield in the air, while dive bombers and torpedo planes delivered the sword below. With radar guiding interceptions, coordinated tactics, and overwhelming industrial power, the Navy created a war machine that Japan simply couldn't match. Every time a Zero was shot down, Japan lost not only an aircraft, but a pilot they couldn't replace. Every time a Hellcat returned, America's air strength grew stronger.
The end of the Zero and the legacy of the Hellcat. By 1945, the Zero was no longer feared. It was a relic, still deadly in skilled hands, but hopeless against waves of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs. The once proud Japanese air arm had been destroyed. Its laughter at the Hellcat years earlier now seemed bitterly ironic. Meanwhile, the Hellcat earned a legacy far beyond statistics. Pilots loved it, mechanics trusted it, admirals relied on it. In the Pacific, it became the backbone of victory. Even after the war, it served as a trainer, a test aircraft, and a reminder of American industrial power. The final tally spoke for itself. 19-to-1 kill ratio. Over 75% of all Navy aerial victories, and a reputation as the most successful carrier fighter of World War II. Reflection. The story of the Hellcat is not just about machines, it's about lessons. The Zero was born from brilliance but trapped by arrogance. Japan believed speed and agility alone could carry the war. They laughed at the heavy American fighter, sure that it could never compete. But the Hellcat was more than metal. It was the embodiment of adaptation, resilience, and determination. Backed by industry, refined by combat experience, and flown by men who refused to surrender, it became the aircraft that swept the Zero from the skies. So next time you see a photograph of that bulky fighter with its wide grin of 6.5 cals, remember, sometimes the underdog doesn't just win. Sometimes it rewrites history.
The forgotten rival, the F4U Corsair. While the Hellcat was stealing headlines, another fighter was rising, the chance-vaught F4U Corsair. With its distinctive bent wings and blistering speed, the Corsair often overshadowed the Hellcat in raw performance. But here's the secret. The Corsair was initially too tricky for carrier landings. Early versions bounced off decks and crashed too often. So the Hellcat became the Navy's workhorse, while the Corsair fought mostly from island bases. Together, though, they formed a deadly duo. The Corsair hunted inland, while the Hellcat kept the skies clear over the fleet. The rivalry between the two fighters remains a hot debate among aviation fans even today. But statistically, the Hellcat carried the heavier burden, simply because it was trusted to do it all. Comparing the Zero and Hellcat, specs and tactics. Let's break down how the two fighters compared head-to-head. Speed, Zero about 331 miles per hour versus Hellcat 380 miles per hour. Climb rate, Zero slightly better in low-altitude climbs, but Hellcat dominated above 15,000 feet. Turn radius, Zero could outturn the Hellcat easily, but turns were traps. Hellcats attacked in diving passes instead. Firepower, Zero, 2 cannons, 2 machine guns. Hellcat, 6 heavy .50 caliber Brownings. The difference was night and day. Survivability. The Zero's lack of armor meant even a short burst could ignite it. The Hellcat, armored and with self-sealing tanks, could limp home riddled with holes. Tactically, this meant that U.S. pilots learned one rule: never dogfight a Zero. Instead, use the boom and zoom. Dive, strike, climb, repeat. The Hellcat turned the Zero's advantages into weaknesses.
Voices from the sky. Pilot testimonies. One Hellcat pilot recalled, "We didn't fear the Zero anymore. We respected it, but we knew we could beat it if we flew smart." Another said, "It was like driving a truck compared to a sports car, but this truck had 6 machine guns and could take a beating. I loved it." Japanese ace Saburo Sakai admitted, "Against the Hellcat, our chances were small. I survived, but many of my friends did not." Adding these human voices makes the story more real. This wasn't just machines fighting. It was young men, often barely out of their teens, facing life or death in seconds. The Industrial War. Factories versus factories. The Pacific Air War wasn't only about pilots, it was about factories. Japan built fewer than 11,000 Zeros during the war. America built over 12,000 Hellcats in just 2 years, plus Corsairs, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and bombers. The U.S. war machine could replace losses almost overnight. Japan could not. By 1944, Japan was sending barely trained boys into combat, while America was churning out thousands of fully equipped, fully trained pilots. This imbalance sealed the Zero's fate long before the final battles. The final year. Kamikazes and desperation. The final act of the Pacific Air War was tragic. As Hellcats shredded Japanese fighters in open combat, Japan resorted to kamikaze attacks. Hellcat squadrons flew endless patrols to intercept suicide planes before they could reach the fleet. Many times they succeeded, but some always got through. Pilots described the horror of watching a burning Zero dive past them, too late to stop, before slamming into the deck of a carrier. Even when shot down, the kamikazes forced the Hellcats to fight a different kind of war, one of attrition, exhaustion, and constant vigilance. The Hellcat's legacy after the war. After 1945, the Hellcat quickly faded from the spotlight. Jet fighters like the F-9F Panther and F-86 Sabre were the future. But the Hellcat remained a respected trainer and even saw combat with smaller nations into the 1950s. Today, surviving Hellcats sit in museums and air shows, roaring back to life to remind us of the machine that once ruled the Pacific skies. Its legacy? Not just as a fighter, but as a symbol of what happens when arrogance meets resilience. The Zero was feared, but it was rigid. The Hellcat was underestimated, but it adapted. And adaptation wins wars.
Before the Hellcat, lessons of Pearl Harbor and Midway. When the Pacific War began, America was caught unprepared. At Pearl Harbor, aircraft sat lined wingtip to wingtip, easy prey for Zeros and bombers. The Hellcat didn't exist yet. The Navy relied on the F-4F Wildcat, a tough little plane but outmatched. At Midway in June 1942, Wildcats fought bravely, but their losses were staggering. Out of 25 Wildcats defending one carrier, only a handful survived. Yet Midway was also proof that tactics, luck, and determination could beat technology. The lessons learned would be written into the design of the Hellcat. Building the Beast, the Grumman Iron Works. The Grumman factory in Bethpage, New York, became known as the Iron Works. Workers there churned out Hellcats around the clock. Unlike Japan's handcrafted Zeros, Hellcats were designed for mass production and easy repair. Wings could be folded for carrier storage. Damaged panels could be swapped in hours. Engines were standardized, interchangeable across squadrons. This industrial might was as important as the plane itself. Pilots joked, if you break a Hellcat, Grumman will send you another one tomorrow.
Training the new pilots. The U.S. Navy built a system to turn farm boys and college kids into combat pilots in months. Hellcats became their classroom. The plane's forgiving nature meant rookies could make mistakes and still live to try again. One instructor said, "The Hellcat made boys into men and men into aces." By contrast, Japanese replacements had barely 100 hours of flight time before combat. They often entered battle against Hellcat squadrons full of seasoned veterans. The result was a massacre. The Solomon Islands Campaign. Testing ground. The Solomon Islands were where the Hellcat first proved itself. Over Rabat and Bougainville, Hellcats clashed with Zeros daily. American pilots reported something shocking. They could finally fight on equal or better terms. For the first time, they felt confidence. One pilot wrote in his diary, "I looked over my shoulder and saw Zero diving on me. Normally, I'd panic. This time, I smiled. I knew my Hellcat would take care of me." The Philippines and Leyte Gulf. The liberation of the Philippines was the Hellcat's crowning moment. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Hellcats shredded Japanese air cover and protected the massive invasion fleet. Admiral Halsey called the Hellcat the backbone of our naval air power. It was here that David McCampbell made history, shooting down 9 planes in one mission, cementing his title as America's top Navy ace.
Technology race. Jets and rockets. By 1944, whispers of jet aircraft began to spread. Germany had the Me-262, a jet fighter faster than anything in the world. Japan was working on its own jet, the Nakajima Kikka, inspired by the Me-262. But for the Pacific, the Hellcat was still king. Its blend of ruggedness, firepower, and adaptability made it unbeatable. Even as the world turned to jets, the Hellcat dominated the last piston-engine air battles of history. Cultural impact. The Hellcat in American imagination.
Back home, the Hellcat became a symbol. Posters showed grinning pilots climbing from their cockpits. Newsreels praised the plane as the answer to Japan's vaunted Zero. Kids built model Hellcats. Newspapers listed ace tallies like baseball scores. The name Hellcat itself carried a kind of ferocity. It was more than a machine. It was morale in metal form. What if the Hellcat never existed? Let's imagine a darker scenario. Without the Hellcat, the U.S. would have relied solely on the Corsair and the older Wildcats. The Corsair might have eventually filled the role, but delays in carrier deployment could have cost lives and battles. Would the U.S. still have won the Pacific? Probably, but slower, bloodier, and with greater losses. The Hellcat shortened the war, saved thousands of pilots, and hastened Japan's defeat.
The Zero's origins. Japan's gamble. Before the war, Japan faced a choice: build heavy, armored fighters like the West, or build a lightweight killer with unmatched agility. They chose the latter, producing the Mitsubishi A6M0. When it debuted in China in 1940, Chinese and even Soviet pilots were shocked. Nothing could turn with it. Nothing could climb as fast. The Zero's legend began before Pearl Harbor, striking fear into anyone who saw it. But this brilliance came with a fatal gamble: no armor, no self-sealing tanks. The Zero was a glass sword, deadly when striking first, but fragile when struck back. The Wildcat, holding the line. The U.S. Navy's F4F Wildcat was slower and clunkier, but it was all America had when war broke out. Wildcat pilots in 1942 fought impossible battles over Wake Island, Guadalcanal, and Midway. They learned painful lessons: never turn with a Zero, never fight alone. Out of necessity came the talk weave, a team tactic where two Wildcats covered each other's tails. This invention kept them alive long enough for something new to arrive: the Hellcat. Engineering the Hellcat, built to win. Grumman engineers worked around the clock. They studied captured Zero wreckage. They interviewed pilots. They asked one question: what do our boys need to survive? The answer was armor, firepower, and power. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine gave it over 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice that of the Zero. Its 6.5 caliber machine guns could shred an enemy in seconds. The prototype flew just weeks after Midway. By 1943, carriers were launching Hellcats into combat. The hunters had arrived. The air war shifts. Rabaul to Tarawa. Over Rabaul, the Zero's fortress, the Hellcat made its name. Pilots reported victories where once they had suffered losses. Over Tarawa, Hellcats escorted Marines hitting the beaches, breaking the Japanese grip on the Central Pacific. Each battle proved the same thing. The Zero was deadly in the hands of a veteran, but the Hellcat was forgiving, rugged, and decisive. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. June 19, 1944, one of the most lopsided air battles in history. Over the Philippine Sea, hundreds of Japanese aircraft rose to meet the U.S. fleet. Radar warned the carriers. The Hellcats launched. Wave after wave of Zeros and dive bombers were cut down. By nightfall, over 300 Japanese planes were gone. The Americans called it the Turkey Shoot. It was the day the Zero's reign ended forever.
The human side. Pilots at war. What was it like to be there? A rookie Hellcat pilot wrote, "I was terrified until I fired. Then I realized, this plane is a killer. It'll protect me if I respect it." A Japanese pilot confessed, "Our leaders told us to laugh at the Hellcat, but laughter died quickly in battle." One U.S. ace said, "The Hellcat wasn't glamorous. It was a bulldog, but I'd pick it every time." Adding these voices brings the war down from statistics to the human heart. Kamikaze, the last storm. By late 1944, Japan's air arm was broken. In desperation, they launched the kamikaze strategy, suicide attacks. For Hellcat pilots, this was a new nightmare. Instead of dogfighting, they scrambled to intercept planes intent on dying. Even when shot full of holes, a Zero might still crash into a carrier. The Hellcats saved countless ships, but not all. The horror of kamikazes marked the war's final act in the sky.
Kamikaze, the last storm. By late 1944, Japan's air arm was broken. In desperation, they launched the kamikaze strategy, suicide attacks. For Hellcat pilots, this was a new nightmare. Instead of dogfighting, they scrambled to intercept planes intent on dying. Even when shot full of holes, a Zero might still crash into a carrier. The Hellcats saved countless ships, but not all. The horror of kamikazes marked the war's final act in the sky. Life on a carrier, the floating cities of war. Before every Hellcat launched into battle, there was a world beneath its wings, the aircraft carriers. The USS Enterprise, Yorktown, and Essex-class carriers became floating fortresses. Pilots lived in cramped quarters, ate powdered eggs, and often didn't know if they'd come back from a mission. Deck crews worked in 120 degrees Fahrenheit heat, refueling planes while kamikazes threatened from above. Hellcats weren't just planes. They were part of a massive war machine. Training the pilots, from civilians to aces. Unlike Japanese pilots who spent years training before Pearl Harbor, America ramped up quickly. Thousands of young men went from classrooms to cockpits in months. Flight schools across the U.S. turned out Hellcat pilots in bulk. Simulators, mock dogfights, and classroom lessons on Zero tactics prepared them. Many were just 19 or 20 years old when they launched into combat. One trainer told his class, "The Zero is fast, but you're flying a Hellcat. Respect your machine. Trust your wingman, and never, ever turn with him."
Beyond the Pacific, Hellcats around the world. Most remember the Hellcat for the Pacific, but it also flew in the Atlantic, hunting U-boats from escort carriers. The British Royal Navy, where it was called the Gannet. Night fighting. Radar-equipped Hellcats hunted Japanese bombers after dark. It wasn't just a Pacific hero, it was a global warrior. The Zero's evolution. Desperate upgrades. Japan tried to keep pace. The A6M50 added more armor and speed. Later versions carried heavier cannons. But the Zero's basic design, light and unarmored, couldn't match the Hellcat's brute force. By late 1944, even Japanese engineers admitted, the Zero cannot compete. The era of the light fighter is over.
America's arsenal, factories of victory. The Hellcat was not just a plane. It was a symbol of U.S. industrial might. Grumman's factory in Bethpage, Long Island, became known as the Iron Works. Assembly lines churned out Hellcats at a pace Japan could never match, up to 500 per month. Workers, many women, riveted, welded, and painted day and night. A worker later said, "Every bolt I tightened, I thought of a boy in the Pacific. If my work kept him alive, it was worth everything." This industrial power guaranteed victory long before the last battle. Japan's struggle, factories under fire. By contrast, Japan's aircraft production was crippled by lack of aluminum and fuel. U.S. bombing raids targeting Mitsubishi and Nakajima factories. No large-scale assembly lines like America's. By 1945, Japan tried to build planes out of wood. Some never even reached combat. The Zero, once a terror, was now outdated and irreplaceable. Tactics evolve, dogfighting in practice. How did pilots actually fight? Hellcat tactics. Use altitude, dive, and firepower. Teamwork was P. Zero tactics. Outturn the enemy, strike first, and disengage quickly. Dogfights became chess matches, speed versus agility, armor versus fragility. A U.S. ace recalled, "When I dove on a Zero, I knew I'd get him if I stayed disciplined, but if I got greedy, he'd turn inside me. Respect the Zero or die."
Technology, radar, and communications. Another overlooked advantage? Radar and radios. U.S. carriers had radar to detect incoming raids. Pilots communicated constantly, coordinating intercepts and warning each other. Japanese pilots often flew blind with no coordinated radar network. This meant the Hellcat was rarely surprised, while the Zero often was. Special variants of the Hellcat. The F6F wasn't just one plane. It evolved into many roles. F6F3/5, Standard Fighter. F6F5N, Night Fighter with radar. F6F5P, Photo Reconnaissance. Rocket and bomb-armed Hellcats, used for ground attack. By 1945, the Hellcat wasn't just a Zero killer. It was a Swiss Army knife of the skies. Psychological warfare, the laughter that died. In 1943, Japanese pilots mocked the Hellcat as a flying barrel, but by 1944, the laughter stopped. Captured pilots admitted they feared Hellcats more than any other U.S. fighter. Morale collapsed as kill ratios skyrocketed. Many flew missions knowing they would never return. One Japanese veteran later said, "The Hellcat was not beautiful, but it was relentless. It was a machine of death."
Final year, the death of the Zero. By 1945, the Zero was obsolete. Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs dominated. Japan turned to kamikaze out of desperation. The once proud Zero, symbol of samurai spirit, became a tool of suicide. The contrast could not be greater. The Hellcat, rugged and victorious. The Zero, fragile and sacrificed. Legacy after the war. What happened after the guns went silent? The Hellcat was retired quickly, replaced by jets. Some went to training squadrons, others were scrapped. The Zero became a museum piece, a relic of a bygone era. Yet their legacy endures. The Hellcat proved that smart engineering, industrial might, and pilot training could defeat even the deadliest enemy. The Zero proved that brilliance without sustainability cannot win a long war. Closing reflections. By the end of World War II, the skies over the Pacific told a clear story. The Zero ruled through fear and agility. The Hellcat ruled through resilience, firepower, and overwhelming numbers. The laughter that greeted the Hellcat in 1943 had turned into silence by 1945. And in that silence, America claimed the skies forever.
The Pacific Theater in context. To understand the Hellcat's role, we need the big picture. 1941 to 42, Japan expands rapidly. Philippines, Malaya, Burma. 1942, Coral Sea and Midway halt Japan's momentum. 1943 to 45, the U.S. begins island hopping, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At every stage, air superiority was decisive. The Hellcat became the hammer that broke Japan's air power. The Carrier War, floating battlefields. The Pacific wasn't about tanks or trenches, it was about carriers. The U.S. launched the Essex-class carriers, 24 of them, each carrying 90-plus Hellcats, Avengers, and dive bombers. Japan, by 1944, was down to just a handful of carriers. The Hellcat was the backbone of these floating airfields. Without it, the U.S. Navy's advance would have stalled. Stories from the cockpit. Bring the human side forward. I heard the bullets ping against my armor, but the Hellcat kept flying. She was a tank with wings. A U.S. Navy pilot. We were told to die with honor, but when the Hellcat appeared behind me, I only felt fear. A Japanese pilot captured 1944. My job was to shoot down men I couldn't see clearly. They were just black dots that turned into flames. A Hellcat ace. These voices remind us that air combat was not just machines. It was youth, fear, and survival.
Women and the war effort. The Hellcat couldn't have flown without the workers behind it. Women riveters, welders, and painters at Grumman factories. Ferry pilots from the WASP, women Air Force service pilots, flew Hellcats across the U.S. to bases. One recalled, "It was heavy, but she was steady. The Hellcat flew like she wanted to keep you alive." Behind every fighter in the Pacific was a silent army of workers. Intelligence, cracking the Zero's secrets. A turning point came when a nearly intact Zero crashed in the Aleutian Islands, Akutan Zero, 1942. Engineers studied it, revealing its strengths and weaknesses. This intelligence directly informed Hellcat design and pilot training. The Zero's mystery was broken, and the Hellcat was the answer. Other rivals in the sky. The Zero wasn't the Hellcat's only opponent. K-43, Oscar, Japanese Army fighter, agile but lightly armed. K-84, Frank, a powerful late-war Japanese fighter but too few built. Kawanishi N-1K, George, dangerous but arrived too late. The Hellcat faced them all and survived. Kamikaze psychology, the last weapon. By 1944, Japan turned to suicide missions. Young men, barely trained, were told they would be human bombs. Many wrote farewell letters, never expecting to return. Hellcats intercepted them daily, sometimes too late. A Hellcat pilot described, "The hardest part wasn't shooting them down. It was watching the ones you missed slam into a ship."
Kamikaze psychology, the last weapon. By 1944, Japan turned to suicide missions. Young men barely trained were told they would be human bombs. Many wrote farewell letters, never expecting to return. Hellcats intercepted them daily, sometimes too late. A Hellcat pilot described, "The hardest part wasn't shooting them down. It was watching the ones you missed slam into a ship." The home front, America at war. While pilots fought in the Pacific, life at home fueled them. War bonds funded planes like the Hellcat. Factories ran 24/7. Families prayed for sons in the Pacific, following headlines of Turkey Shoot victories and Iwo Jima. The Hellcat became a symbol of American resolve. From propeller to jet age. By 1945, jet fighters were emerging. The German Me-262 was the world's first operational jet. Japan tried to copy it with the Nakajima Kikka, but too late. The Hellcat was among the last of the great piston-engine kings. It marked the end of an era, the last hero before jets took over.